The silence that followed the blow was heavier than any scream. Inside the dim chambers of the Kremlin, beneath the golden crosses and the smell of cold iron, a father's rage had torn to the heart of an empire. Ivan IV, called the Terrible, stood trembling, his hands slick with blood, his eyes wide, unseeing. Before him lay his son, the Tsarevich Ivanovich, gasping, broken, eyes flickering between life and the eternity that waited. What had begun as fury ended as tragedy. The sound of the dying prince's breath echoed through those marble halls, and in that moment, Russia itself seemed to hold its breath. This is not just a story of a tyrant's madness. It is the unraveling of a man haunted by power, by war, by betrayal, and by ghosts' own making. It is the story of how a father became executioner to his heir, and how an empire paid the price for one act of rage. Before we descend into this dark history, remember to like, subscribe, and follow for more true stories of power, tragedy, and the shadows of the past. Each week, we bring history's most haunting moments back to life, not to glorify them, but to understand what power does to the human soul. The winter of 1533 swallowed Moscow in silence. Snow fell like shrouds over the onion domes of the Kremlin, muting the sound of bells, masking the cries that echoed through the narrow streets. Inside the royal palace, a boy, only 3 years old, sat beside his dying father, Vasily III, the Grand Prince of Moscow. The court whispered prayers that no one truly believed would be answered. As the Tsar drew his final breath, the boy's small hands clutched the fur blanket tighter, his eyes wide with confusion that would soon turn to fear. He was now Ivan IV, heir to a kingdom built on treachery, and surrounded by wolves who waited for the moment to tear it apart. The years that followed were a lesson in cruelty. Ivan's mother, Elena Glinskaya, assumed the regency. A young woman, clever but inexperienced, tried to navigate the venomous core boyars, the powerful noble families who despised her bloodline. She tried to protect her son, but protection in Moscow was fleeting. Poison came quicker than loyalty. In 1538, she died suddenly, her lips turning blue, her body convulsing. Rumor whispered it was murder, that the boyars had taken from Ivan the only shield he had left. At 8 years old, he was alone in a palace filled with predators. The boyars fought for control of the throne, like vultures over a carcass. They ignored the child who was supposed to be their czar. They beat him, mocked him, starved him. Servants stole his food. Guards struck him for amusement. Some nights, he would wander the corridors of the Kremlin, barefoot, whispering prayers into the cold, listening to the laughter of men who ruled in his name. He began to study them, their greed, their cruelty, memorizing the faces of those who had made him suffer. He learned that power was not given, it was taken. And when taken, it must be held with an iron hand. There were moments, fleeting and fragile, when the boy's humanity surfaced. He loved to read, to bury himself in stories of saints and conquerors, men who wielded both sword and faith. But as he grew, the line between those worlds began to blur. To him, holiness and violence were not opposites. They were allies, twin blades of divine purpose. If God allowed kings to rule, then God must also permit kings to destroy. By the time Ivan turned 16, Moscow had become a city wrapped in fear. The boyars still schemed, but whispers had begun. The young Tsar watches, the young Tsar remembers. And indeed he did. He had spent years observing their deceit, letting it ferment like rot in his mind. On a frozen January morning in 1547, Ivan was crowned the first Tsar of all Russia. Not just a prince, but a sovereign ordained by God. The ceremony was grand and sacred, filled with golden robes, icons, and chanting priests. Yet beneath that holy theater, something darker stirred. Ivan saw the crown not as a burden, but as a weapon. He married Anastasia Romanovna, a gentle woman of grace and piety. For a brief time, her presence softened him. She spoke kindly, calmed his rages, and reminded him that even kings were human. But peace has never lasted long in the halls of power. In the first years of his reign, Moscow burned, a great fire sweeping through the city, devouring homes, churches, and lives. The people blamed the boyars blamed Ivan. Conspiracies bloomed like weeds. He began to see enemies everywhere. Even laughter in the court seemed to mock him. And then came the first deaths. Those who had tormented him as a child, men who had starved him, humiliated him, began to vanish. Some were arrested at midnight, dragged through the snow, their screams echoing down the Kremlin's corridors. Others were found days later, their bodies twisted, their faces frozen in terror. To Ivan, it was not cruelty. It was justice long delayed. He told himself that this was order, that a czar must cleanse his land of corruption. But something had shifted in him, something irreversible. Where once he had punished, now he enjoyed the act of punishment. He began to see himself not as God's servant, but as his instrument of wrath. Anastasia watched in silence as her husband's eyes grew colder. She saw the boy he once was, frightened, wounded, drowning beneath the man he had become. She begged him to trust, to forgive, to let go of the ghosts that haunted him. But Ivan could not. Forgiveness was for the weak. Mercy was for the dead. And somewhere deep within him, that frightened child of the Kremlin whispered, "Never again." The court grew quiet when Ivan entered a room. Servants bowed lower. Voices trembled more easily. Even his friends began to measure their words. He was brilliant, unpredictable, and terrifying. His laughter could turn to fury in a heartbeat. The boy who had once been powerless now wielded absolute power, and it thrilled him. The birth of his sons brought brief light into his darkening world. For a moment, it seemed that love might conquer the shadows of his past. Yet the deeper he loved, the more he feared loss. He clung to his family with a desperate intensity, even as he alienated everyone else. In his heart, love and fear were indistinguishable. Both could drive a man to madness. As the years passed, that madness deepened. The seeds planted in his childhood, betrayal, paranoia, pain, grew into a forest of suspicion that would one day consume him, his family, and his entire realm. The boy who had been victimized had become the monster of his own making, and soon Russia would tremble before him. The coronation had crowned more than a czar. It had birthed a storm. Ivan IV, now secure in his divine right, began reshaping Russia in his own image, not as a kingdom of faith, but as a fortress of fear. He saw treachery in every shadow, rebellion in every whisper, and the face of betrayal in every mirror. Yet beneath the heavy gold of his crown, a man still wrestled with the ghost of his boyhood. A man desperate to control what had once controlled him. To rule, he told himself, one must be both shepherd and wolf. For a time, he tried to lead as a reformer. He restructured the army, reformed the laws, and founded a centralized administration meant to weaken the power of the boyars. He built churches and invited scholars to his court. It was as if he wanted to cleanse Russia with his vision, to create order from chaos. But order cannot survive in the mind of a man who trusts no one. Then came tragedy. In 1560, Anastasia, the only soul who had ever softened the iron in him, fell ill. At first, Ivan dismissed it as another fever, but the sickness grew quickly, violently. When she died, his world shattered. The palace was drenched in mourning, but for Ivan, grief was not tears, it was rage. He screamed accusations at everyone who dared to enter his chambers. He was certain she had been poisoned by the boyars, his eternal enemies. Whether this was truth or madness, no one could say. But something broke inside him that day. Without Anastasia, there was no voice left to pull him back from the edge. His grief became paranoia. He withdrew from court for weeks, refusing counsel, refusing sleep. When he emerged, his face was gaunt, his eyes hollow but blazing. He had come to a decision that would forever stain his reign with blood. If Russia would not be loyal to its czar, then it would fear him. Thus was born the Oprichnina, a realm within a realm, a government within a government, commanded only by Ivan himself. The czar divided Russia in two, the boyars' lands and his own sacred dominion. He filled this new empire with men dressed in black, the Oprichniki, his personal order of executioners and enforcers. They rode black horses, carried severed dog heads on their saddles to sniff out treachery, and wielded brooms to sweep clean the filth of Russia. Their loyalty was absolute. Their cruelty was legend. What followed was not governance but purification, or so Ivan called it. Villages burned under accusation of treason. Noble families vanished overnight. Monasteries were sacked, churches desecrated, women and children slaughtered. The Tsar watched, sometimes from his window, sometimes from the saddle, sometimes seated in the front row of an execution, his face unreadable. He told his priest that these acts were holy, that the enemies of the Tsar were the enemies of God. Even the clergy began to tremble when he crossed himself. And yet, amid all this terror, Ivan saw himself as righteous. In his mind, he was not destroying Russia, he was saving it from the treachery of nobles who had mocked him, from the corruption of men who called themselves loyal. Each execution, each village raze was an act of divine justice. He spoke often of purification, of sacrifice, of blood as a cleansing fire. But the fire does not choose whom it burns. In 1570, suspicion fell upon the city of Novgorod, a thriving hub of merchants and scholars, accused by rumor conspiring with foreign powers. Ivan's wrath was immediate and absolute. He led his Oprichnina there himself. For 5 weeks, the city was drowned in horror. The sound of bells was replaced by the wailing of mothers, the gurgle of men dragged beneath the ice, the crackle of homes burning under the winter sky. Thousands perished, monks, peasants, nobles, all accused of treason. The Fokhof River ran red for days, carrying corpses down to Lake Ilmen. And through it all, Ivan prayed. He prayed as he killed, as if his prayers could sanctify the blood he spilled. The Oprichnina became a symbol of his madness, a reign where faith and fear were indistinguishable. His subject began to see him as both saint and devil. The chroniclers of his court wrote in whispers, their words trembling between truth and survival. To speak ill of the Tsar was death. To praise him too lightly was suspicion. The air of Moscow itself grew heavy with dread. Yet in private, there were cracks in his armor. Some nights, his servants heard him weeping in the chapel, begging God to forgive him, then shouting that God himself had betrayed him. The same hands that blessed bread and prayer would, hours later, sign death warrants. The man who had once dreamed of uniting Russia now ruled over ruins built from his own paranoia. Still, he was not without brilliance. His wars against the Tatars and the Livonian order expanded Russia's borders. His mind, though tormented, was sharp and strategic. But even victory turned to ashes in his mouth. Every triumph deepened his isolation. Every conquest fed the delusion that only he could save his empire. And beneath that illusion, a deeper truth stirred, one he refused to face. That the true enemy of Russia was not the boyars, not foreign invaders, not conspirators in distant cities. The true enemy was himself. As his Oprichnina's blades dulled with blood, Ivan's eyes turned inward, toward his own family. His eldest son, Ivan Ivanovich, now grown, was everything his father was not. Calm, intelligent, beloved by the people. He questioned his father's cruelty, begged him to temper justice with mercy. But to Ivan IV, dissent was treason, even when spoken by his own flesh and blood. And so the stage was set. The terror that had consumed Russia was about to devour the Tsar's own house. The corridors of the Kremlin had grown quieter by the 1580s. The fires of Novgorod's destruction had faded into legend. The cries of the Oprichnina now whispered only in memory. But within the walls of Moscow, a quieter storm was brewing, one that would not scorch cities but shatter a family. The Tsarevich Ivan Ivanovich, the firstborn son of Ivan the Terrible, had come of age, and in his bearing, in his gentleness and his fire, the people saw not the shadow of his father, but the glimmer of a different kind of Tsar, a ruler who might bring mercy where there had only been blood. He was handsome, devout, and wise beyond his years. Unlike his father, he sought counsel from priests and scholars, not spies. He walked among the poor, spoke softly, and treated others with dignity. The boyars loved him, or at least, they learned to hope through him. The people called him the Light of Russia, a prince who might one day heal the wounds his father had carved into the land. Yet even light, in a kingdom built on fear, casts dangerous shadows. Ivan forewatched his son with pride that twisted into unease. The Tsarevich was everything he had once dreamed to be, and everything he had lost. The Tsar loved his son fiercely, but that love was poisoned by jealousy, by paranoia, by the old voices that whispered a betrayal. To Ivan, admiration from others was a warning sign. If the people loved his son too much, Might they love the father less? Might they wish to replace the old Tsar with the young? The same fear that had driven him to destroy the boyars now turned inward, toward his own blood. The court felt the tension like the weight of a storm before rain. Their conversations grew cautious when father and son entered the same room. The Tsar's laughter with his heir could shift into venom in a heartbeat. Even the Tsarevich's successes, his military campaigns, his popularity, became thorns in Ivan's pride. One evening, after hearing that his son had spoken passionately to defend the people suffering during a famine, Ivan turned cold. "You think you know compassion better than I?" he hissed, his voice low, trembling not with anger, but with humiliation. "You would challenge the will of God and your own father?" The Tsarevich bowed, silent, his eyes filled not with fear, but sorrow. In another life, perhaps they could have found peace. Two men bound by the same torment, separated by the way they faced it. But fate and the Tsar's own rage would not allow it. In 1581, Moscow was gripped by despair. War had drained the treasury. Famine haunted the streets, and Ivan's mind grew darker with each passing month. His third wife, Maria Nagaya, was pregnant, and the Tsar, despite his age and weariness, longed for another heir. But the Tsarevich's wife, young and radiant, had also conceived, a blessing in any other court, but in Ivan's world, joy and suspicion shared the same cradle. The story of what happened next has been told in many versions, some whispered in monasteries, others painted by the brush of artists centuries later. But they all agree on one truth. It began with anger and ended in tragedy. The Tsar entered his son's chambers unannounced one afternoon. He found the Tsarevich's wife standing by the window, weeping. Her robe was thin, her face pale, her body trembling. The Tsar's gaze fell to her stomach, swollen with life, and then to the terrified servants who dared not speak. Ivan's voice cut through the silence. "Why is she dressed so immodestly?" he demanded. The woman fell to her knees, begging forgiveness, saying she had been too warm, that she had meant no disrespect. But the Tsar's fury had already ignited. He saw in her fear not innocence, but defiance. He struck her once, twice, until she collapsed. Blood stained the floor, and within days she miscarried. When the Tsarevich learned what his father had done, he stormed into the throne room. He did not kneel. His voice, usually calm, trembled with grief and rage. "You have murdered my child," he cried. "You have destroyed your own blood." The words pierced deeper than any blade, and for a moment the Tsar faltered. But humiliation, for a man who ruled through fear, was intolerable. "Silence!" Ivan roared, rising from his seat, his scepter trembling in his hand. "You dare accuse your Tsar? You dare raise your voice against your father? You are no father," the Tsarevich answered. "You are the ruin of Russia." The room froze. The guards did not move. The courtiers did not breathe. Ivan's eyes went wide, not with shock, but with madness. In that instant, all the betrayals of his past, all the ghosts of his childhood, all the faces that had laughed at him, merged into one, his son's. He lifted the scepter, heavy with gold and fury, and struck the Tsarevich on the head. The sound was sickening, a dull crack, followed by a gasp. The Tsarevich fell to his knees, his hands clutching his bleeding temple. The Tsar stood over him, his chest heaving, his rage unraveling into horror as crimson began to pool on the marble floor. "My son," he whispered, dropping the scepter. "My son." He fell beside him, cradling his body, pressing his hand against the wound, as if he could will the blood to stop. But the wound was mortal. Witnesses say Ivan screamed for help, that he tore his robes, that he wept like a madman as the Tsarevich's breath grew shallow. "Forgive me," he repeated, again and again, clutching the dying prince. "Forgive me, my son, my light." The Tsarevich, his voice faint, murmured words no one could fully hear. Some say it was forgiveness. Others say it was a prayer. He died in his father's arms. The Tsar's cries echoed through Kremlin that night. Cries of grief so deep they chilled even those who had long feared him. He beat his chest, cursed his hands, begged the heavens for mercy. But mercy does not dwell in the hearts of tyrants, and forgiveness, once lost, is seldom found again. That day, Russia lost its future. and Ivan the Terrible lost his soul. The Kremlin never slept after that night. For days, candles burned in every window, their light flickering over stone walls that seemed to bleed with memory. Outside, snow fell soundlessly, blanketing Moscow in white as if the heavens themselves tried to hide the stain of what had been done. Inside, the corridors echoed not with footsteps, but with sobs and whispers. The Tsar's guards, hardened men who had witnessed executions and massacres, now wept quietly in corners. None dared speak of what they had seen, yet all knew the Tsar had slain his own son. In the Tsarevich's chamber, the air hung heavy with incense and sorrow. Priests chanted the prayers of the dying, their voices trembling as they passed across over his still form. His golden hair, matted with dried blood, glowed faintly in the candlelight. His body, wrapped in fine silk, looked peaceful, too peaceful for the brutality that had ended him. Outside the door, his father knelt on the cold floor motionless, his robe stained with his son's blood. For 3 days, he refused food and sleep, whispering only to the lifeless body within. Those who approached him said he looked like a man already dead. On the 3rd day, he rose. His eyes were hollow, his face ashen. The court watched as he walked the cathedral for his son's funeral, his steps slow, deliberate, like a man walking toward judgment. The bells tolled, deep and mournful, their sound rolling to the city like thunder. When the coffin was lowered into the ground, Ivan's cry tore through the silence. It was not the roar of a king, but the wail of a father, a sound that those who heard would never forget. After the burial, Ivan withdrew from the world. He dismissed audiences, ignored counsel, and locked himself in his private chapel. There, surrounded by icons and candlelight, he prayed with a desperation that bordered on madness. He struck his head against the floor in penance, his voice hoarse from weeping. But there was no comfort left in heaven for him. The priests spoke of forgiveness, yet even they could not look him in the eye. He had broken a law older than kings, the law of blood, the sacred bond between father and child. Rumors spread beyond the Kremlin walls like wildfire. Some said the Tsar had gone mad completely, that he wandered the corridors speaking to his son's ghost. Others swore they saw him at night, barefoot, carrying a candle through the snow, calling his son's name. Whether these tales were true or born of fear, no one could say. But in every corner of Russia, from the forests of Novgorod to the frozen rivers of the north, the people whispered the same word: curse. The boyars dared not speak of succession. The Tsarevich had been the hope of the realm, the one who might have brought stability after decades of blood. Now that hope lay buried. Ivan's younger son, Fifer, was gentle but frail, lacking the strength to rule. The empire, like its ruler, began to decay from within. The Oprichnina, already fading, dissolved completely. Its black-clad riders disappeared, their terror replaced by silence. For the first time in his reign, Ivan's enemies no longer feared him. They pitied him. But pity is a fragile thing. As the years crept forward, Ivan's grief twisted into self-loathing, and his self-loathing into cruelty once more. He lashed out at courtiers for imagined slights, executed advisors without reason, and alternated between holy visions and fits of violence. Some days he seemed lucid, speaking gently of faith and repentance. Other days he raged at invisible foes, screaming that the devil himself sat beside him. It was as though his soul, once torn by fury, now existed only in fragments. Yet even in madness, Ivan understood the magnitude of what he had done. The Tsarevich had been more than a son. He had been the future of Russia, the bridge between chaos and order, cruelty and compassion. By killing him, Ivan had not only murdered his heir, he had murdered the possibility of redemption. And in the vacuum that followed, the seeds of Russia's future darkness were sown. Pain became his companion. Those who tended to him said he spoke often of dreams, of a river running red, of a child's voice calling from the ice. In one of his final confessions, recorded by a frightened priest, Ivan reportedly said, "I see his face in every prayer. I feel his blood upon my hands, and it burns even when I sleep." Whether this was guilt or delusion mattered little. Both had become one. He surrounded himself with relics and holy icons, desperate for some sign that God had forgiven him. But the icons remained silent, and heaven gave no answer. The Tsar's health began to fail. His body, once strong and commanding, grew frail. He trembled when he walked, and his once fierce eyes dulled to the color of ash. Still, he clung to power, not out of ambition, but out of fear. Fear that the moment he released his grip, the ghosts he had created would finally claim him. And perhaps they did. One night, as snow fell softly outside the palace, Ivan summoned his guards and ordered a final prayer service. When it ended, he dismissed everyone except his confessor. The priest later said the Tsar had wept openly, whispering, "I have been Tsar to millions, but father to none." He died the next morning, kneeling beside his bed, his crown lying at his feet. When the news spread, the bells of Moscow tolled once more, not in triumph, but in exhaustion. The empire he had built, the terror he had unleashed, the dynasty he had shattered, all stood as monuments to a single moment of rage. In killing his son, Ivan the Terrible had not only broken his lineage, but ensured that Russia itself would inherit his madness. The time of troubles, the years of famine, rebellion, and foreign invasion that followed his death would be his true legacy, the echo of one man's ungoverned fury rippling through generations. Even now, historians debate the truth of that fatal blow. Some claim it was accident. Others insist it was deliberate. But whether it was a hand of fate or the will of a man, one thing remained certain. That moment changed Russia forever. And in that stillness after the blow, as the blood of his son cooled upon the floor, Ivan IV, Tsar, father, tyrant, finally understood what power cannot undo. When the body of Ivan IV was laid to rest in the Cathedral of the Archangel, the air of Moscow hung still and heavy. The people, who had once trembled at the very mention of his name, gathered in hushed silence outside the Kremlin gates. The bells tolled slow and deep, carrying over the frozen river like a lament for an empire that had bled too long. The reign of the first Tsar had ended, not in triumph, not in glory, but in ruin. Yet even in death, Ivan's shadow loomed vast, stretching across the centuries like a scar that refused to fade. Russia had known kings before, but never one like him. He had unified the land, expanded its borders, and proclaimed the birth of the Tsardom, a nation that no longer bowed to outsiders. But his victory had come at a cost too great for any throne to bear. The soil of Russia was soaked with the blood of its own sons, its cities haunted by the echo of his rage. The people spoke his name with fear, but also with awe, as though he were both cursed and sacred. They could not decide whether to despise him or to mourn him. In the years that followed, his surviving son, Fifer, ascended the throne, a gentle ruler, pious and mild, but utterly unfit for the weight of empire. The court, once held together by terror, began to fracture. Famine spread, invasions came, and soon the dynasty Ivan had built crumbled into chaos. Historians would call it the time of troubles, a decade when Russia seemed to lose not only its ruler, but its soul. Some saw this collapse as divine retribution, God's punishment for the Tsar's sins. Others saw it as the inevitable end of a kingdom built upon fear. Whatever the truth, one thing was clear. Ivan's rage had outlived him. His legacy would haunt Russia's rulers for centuries. The Romanovs, who rose after the chaos, inherited not just his throne, but his shadow. Every Tsar after him, from Peter the Great to Nicholas II, would wrestle with the same dilemma: how to rule a land shaped by tyranny without becoming tyrants themselves. And in each generation, echoes of Ivan's voice could be heard, in the paranoia of monarchs, in the cruelty of autocrats, in the endless cycle of reform and repression that marked Russia's destiny. Yet even beyond politics, Ivan became something greater and more terrible than a man. He became myth. To some, he was a monster, the embodiment of despotism, the father of Russian autocracy, whose madness poisoned centuries of rule. To others, he was a necessary evil, a ruler forged by chaos, who brought order through fear. The church canonized those he murdered, yet it never quite condemned him outright. The people, for all their suffering, told stories of his cunning, his faith, his visions. They called him Grozny, the Terrible, not in the sense of wickedness alone, but of awe, of power beyond comprehension. In art, he found a kind of immortality. Centuries later, in the quiet of a studio far from the Kremlin, the painter Ilya Repin would capture the moment that defined him, a painting so raw it silenced every viewer who stood before it. In Ivan the Terrible and his son Ivan on November 16th, 1581, the Tsar is shown clutching his dying son, eyes wide with madness and horror. Blood stains his hands. The son's head rests in his lap, and in that moment, frozen forever in oil and color, one can see the full weight of his damnation. It is not the face of power nor of cruelty, but a man who has realized too late what he has destroyed. The painting, when unveiled, caused an uproar. Some demanded it be banned, claiming it insulted the memory of a Tsar. Others wept before it, unable to look away. Repin's brush had done what no chronicler could. It made the horror eternal. But perhaps that was fitting. For Ivan's true legacy was not his empire, not his wars, not his crown. It was his humanity, that fragile, fractured humanity that could not bear the weight of power. He was, in the end, the most tragic of figures, a man who loved his country so deeply he strangled it, who sought to protect his bloodline and destroyed it with his own hands. In him lived the paradox of every ruler who has ever believed that terror could forge peace. Even now, centuries later, his name remains a mirror in which Russia still sees itself. Every generation finds in him what it fears most. Cruelty disguised as strength, faith corrupted by violence, love transformed into possession. His ghost lingers in stories told by candlelight, in the whispers of priests, in the very stones of the Kremlin that once echoed his footsteps. There are places, they say, where his shadow still walks, a tall, bent figure in robes of black, searching for the sun he can never find. In the silence of history, his final words remain unknown. No chronicle recorded them. No priest dared to speak them aloud. But if one listens closely, to the tolling bells of Moscow, to the sigh of the wind across the frozen plains, one might imagine what they were. Not a prayer, not a command, not the voice of a Tsar, but the broken whisper of a man who has seen too much of his own darkness. "Forgive me," he might have said. "Forgive me, my son." And perhaps, somewhere beyond the reach of crowns and swords and sins, that forgiveness was heard.